Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge, direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
No one likes to admit it, but when your QMS is a mess, you're relying on tribal knowledge that could walk out the door at any moment. Greenlight Guru Quality unites SOPs, documents, and the product development ecosystem into one living system from idea to post-market. Check it out at www.greenlight.guru. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm the host for today's episode. Today I want to talk about just kind of the reimbursement landscape and how it affects different regions of the world. With me today to talk about this is Karandeep Singh Badwal, who is a seasoned quality and regulatory consultant specializing in software as a medical device and artificial intelligence applications. And with over a decade of experience, Karandeep has been instrumental in guiding MedTech companies through the intricate regulatory landscapes across various markets. He's also the host of the MedTech podcast, where he delves into the journeys of industry leaders and the evolving dynamics of the medical technology sector. So I'm excited to have him on. If you follow very many people in the space on LinkedIn, he is probably one you've come across. He's a very popular and well-known name in MedTech. So thank you and welcome to the show, Karandeep.
Thank you, Brian, for Etienne. It's always a pleasure to be back on.
So when we talk about reimbursement, what's the point of even talking about reimbursement when it comes to medical device development and design? Because early on, we're developing a medical device. Why do we need to be thinking about reimbursement?
So being someone who's in regulatory, I always had that bias of saying regulatory first early on in my career. Then I started speaking to people in reimbursement and just generally from the business aspect. For example, if you can get regulatory approval, that's great. It means that you've worked very hard towards it. But if nobody's going to buy your device or it's not economically viable, then you don't have a viable business, and that's what you need to look for. Of course, there's exceptions to this. For example, if you're a charity or a not-for-profit, that's a completely different story. But most people in these games are effectively a business and they want to get some sort of money out of it. So reimbursement is key. You might have everything, and I've seen it before with some of my clients where I say, great, you're definitely going to get regulatory approval. The clinical data exists. You're doing everything right, but you don't have a profitable business. And if you don't have a profitable business, then it's not worth pursuing, because the last thing you want to do is invest millions into a company, get your regulatory approval, and then find out you're not making very many sales.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing because when I think about sales and reimbursement, they're closely tied together. You could have a great sales team, but you have no way of making money because it's not set up for the hospitals to pay you. And so sometimes I think in this industry, we get a little bit caught up in the terminology reimbursement just by itself. How will you get paid? Who is going to pay you? And through what means will they pay you? So I wonder if you could maybe guide us a little bit through the different major markets like the US, Europe, Asia. So just some of the maybe high-level differences in how those reimbursement systems are set up.
Sure. It's an interesting point that you bring up there, Etienne, as well. Depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, you may have an insurance-based system like the US, you may have a government-based system like the EU and some parts of Asia. So it can vary effectively, but it's very important that you consider it. And this, aside from regulatory, also might be a deciding factor of which target market you're going to have first. It's always the debate of US versus EU, and some argue that the US is easier from a regulatory standpoint. But from a reimbursement standpoint, it may make sense to go to the EU and vice versa. So these are definitely things we have to consider. So like you mentioned, we could break it down to the three I'll be discussing today. So that's the US, Europe, and Asia. Now, when it comes to the US, you primarily got things like Medicare and Medicaid effectively when it comes down to reimbursement. Whilst private insurers can sometimes set their own policies, this can vary accordingly. And there's three key elements that you have to consider here when you're working with the US. There's coding, so that could be CPT and HCPCS, which I'll get onto in a minute, coverage, and payment. So CPT stands for current procedural terminology, which is basically like a physician billing code. Think of it a code of which they can work out how they bill. And HCPCS, which is Healthcare Common Procedure Coding System. And that covers everything from medical devices, drugs, and supplies. It's not specific to medical devices, also drugs and supplies. So those things that you need to look into. And that's basically how it works in the US. Now, sometimes, especially talking about my SAMD and AI background as well, AI-based radiology tools sometimes struggle with the Medicare system because it requires both clinical and economic evidence before coverage. And especially when you have a new technology, there may be clinical data available, but there may not be any real-world evidence or economic evidence to prove that it's actually going to be viable because it's something completely new and it's maybe not been used before. Now, when it comes to Europe, of course, the EU is quite harmonized, but we also need to remember how it differs, from the US. The US is one country, but Europe is made of a set of different countries. And of course, each and every country has its own different set of requirements, but there is a lot of harmonization. So every country has basically its own assessment system when it comes to reimbursement. So for example, Germany has what's known as NUB, which is hospital specific reimbursement programs, which allow new medical technologies to come in. There's also DIGA, which is basically, I'm not going to talk about that, how to pronounce it, but it's to do with digital hubs and software medical devices. So it allows prescription-based digital tools to be covered. And there's also the EU HTA regulation, which aims to sort of harmonize the reimbursement system. So there are talks in Europe as well to try and harmonize them. So the issue that companies are going to have, especially startups, when they get their CE mark approval within the EU, okay, that's great. But then they now have to navigate the separate reimbursement processes within each country. It can be a little bit of a pain point for that company as well, because, okay, great, you've got your CE mark, you can legally sell. But from a reimbursement standpoint, if you want to sell in France, or if you want to sell in Germany, the systems are going to be different and it may be difficult getting approved in each and every jurisdiction that you want to go to. Now, when we get on to Asia, of course, now that is a highly fragmented market. What do I mean by that? So when it comes to Japan, they have something known as foreign average pricing. So it's a reimbursement system based on the average price of devices in other countries. Now you can see, Etienne, where this causes an issue. If you have one type of device and there's one sort of price that is average around the world, yet your device costs 3 times as much, from a reimbursement standpoint, it may not work for you. However, on the other hand, if you've come up with something that's basically a third of that, then it can work in your favor. So the issue you have is a set price of something that may work in your favor, may not work in your favor. China basically has what's known as a volume-based procurement. So the government contracts often drive down the cost, and that can make pricing negotiations quite tough in that market. And in Korea as well, they have something known as a National Health Insurance Service, which sort of controls reimbursement. So the real issue here is basically when it comes to reimbursement, it's a completely different minefield to regulatory, and it's something that you need to think about at the start. And that's also going to drive in terms of which jurisdictions you target first, or in some cases, it may be that you don't go to that jurisdiction at all, because unfortunately, although you'll get the regulatory approval, there may be some demand from a reimbursement point of view. It may not be profitable or economically viable for you. And I think the step in the right direction here is what Europe is doing with the HTA regulation, is having some sort of harmonized reimbursement for the whole of Europe. And I think that will make a big impact in terms of how companies target the EU market.
Wow. I thought I understood a certain amount of reimbursement, but you covered a lot of ground, especially the particularly about Asia, and how I like that idea of that strategy. If you have a third the cost, the average price could make you a lot more profit or increase those margins compared to some of your competitors. That's really interesting. And I'm curious, and maybe this is just, feel free to punt if this is, not really in your wheelhouse, but who typically covers the reimbursement strategy, or whose job is it to establish this in a typical medical device company?
So in the same way that you may have a quality or regulatory consultant or health economics consultant, and sometimes it could be the people that work in health economics, sometimes they do a great job of reimbursement. But my personal recommendation is find someone that's worked in that jurisdiction before, ideally with your types of products, so they know how to negotiate with different types of governments, because, the negotiation tactics you may use in Asia may not work in the US and vice versa. Every other country in the world has their own way of doing things, and you want somebody who understands the system. So my view here is have some sort of reimbursement expert that may also be the health economics consultant that you have on board. But like with any job that you want done properly, go and speak to the guy or the girl who's been doing this for years on end in that particular jurisdiction. They're going to guide you the best way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I don't want to get into politics necessarily. However, being in the United Kingdom and me being in the US, this year I feel like politics is going to overlay a lot of every conversation, a lot of conversations we have in the quality and regulatory space for medical devices, particularly with the change in administration in the US and all of the different things that are happening, as well as around tariffs and so on. And I'm wondering if you have any thought or if seen any trends on how companies are going to navigate this way or that way, or become more segregated to one region based on the amount of just the cost associated with going to other countries. I don't know if you have any thought on that, or any guidance on how companies can navigate some of those particular, governmental difficulties as they are today?
So if you went back to last week, we'll probably comment on the FDA layoffs and how people reinstated. So I'm glad that happened. And Etienne, it's very timely that you bring this podcast on because as of today, the UK Prime Minister has actually abolished the NHS, the National Health System, and is looking to have a complete shake-up. So that's another thing that's happening out in the
Wow.
world.
Yeah.
So at this moment in time, it may work to our benefit, it may not work to our benefit. So nobody really knows. So again, particularly when it comes to a political climate, it's just kind of build that within your business strategy. Bear in mind, again, I hope this never happens, but things like wars happen across the world. There's
Right.
political change. There could be new leaders coming in, and all of this affects your company. And these are things that you need to account for. So have a bit of leeway for that. And that is why I say, avoid just having one target jurisdiction. Of course, have the main one that makes the most sense for you. But anything can change tomorrow. So, always have a plan where maybe there's another jurisdiction you can target. Things are always changing around the world, and particularly with the FDA layoffs, there are a lot of companies who would think, we want to go to the US. And then if you've only got half the amount of assessors, that's obviously going to increase the amount of time. And then it may be that you go back to the EU again. So my view, of course, is in your regulatory strategy, yes, of course, have a primary jurisdiction that you want. But due to the unpredictability of the world, whether it's a political standpoint, regulations, etc., have other jurisdictions that you also have in mind should your first plan not work.
I think that's good advice. You have that primary region you want to go to. Maybe there's a list of others, and excuse me, if you go through that list and you say, okay, this is what our anticipated margins are going to be in this region. This is what our anticipated margins in this region. We can be profitable in these different regions, whether it's we're going up against tariffs, whether we're going up against regulatory difficulties, timelines, et cetera. We could still be profitable, but then there may be some that are going to be below that line. You say, okay, well, I'm going to cross that region off for now for these reasons. And if you document those reasons, in this industry, we're all about documentation. You may be able to circle back and bring that region back up as things change, because it seems the only constant is change at the moment. So, and maybe it's always been that way, and I'm finally old enough to recognize it. That being said, I know you already mentioned some about software as a medical device. You already mentioned some about AI and your experience there. Are there any unique challenges, other than the ones you've already mentioned, that these technologies face in the current reimbursement frameworks?
Yeah, very much so. Number one could be no established billing codes. And, we can go also back to
Right.
the FDA 510K product codes as well. When a newer technology comes along, you often have to go down the de novo route. And it can also exist a billing codes as well. If there's a new type of technology, there may not necessarily be a billing code that exactly is right for that particular type of product that you're going to come into as well. The second one, of course, is real world clinical and economic evidence, because this is something quite new, or maybe there's not a lot of it on the market. How exactly do you prove any cost effective proof, because there's nothing else currently on the market? And in terms of real world data, this can be limited to none. So that's another issue that you may face as well. Another one, of course, is when you have these issues where there's no real world clinical or economic evidence, this can potentially delay your reimbursement statutory. So this can take potentially years. So for example, like people say regulatory can take years. Reimbursement can also take years as well. So that's something you have to consider. So that's why I say it's very important at the start to figure out how long this is going to take. So, if you're still in the baby phases of your company and you're not going to make a product for 4 years from now, brilliant. You can go out and collect the clinical data. The last thing you want to do is get to that point and thinking, we don't have any clinical data for regulatory and we don't have any for reimbursement. What do we do now? And Etienne, despite the education and the great platform that you have, it's far more common than we actually should be. There's a lot of information out there, but then sometimes companies, they delay the regulatory, they delay the reimbursement, which is understandable. They're raising funds, marketing,
Sure.
etc. But that's a mistake that they often make. So this is quite common, and you'll see it as well. A startup may get FDA clearance, but then realize there's no real reimbursement pathway, which goes back to what I was saying earlier as well. And this, you can actually see this as well. So if you go into the FDA board database, there'll be products that get their 510K and never hit the US market. Now, in some cases, some companies get a 510K because they're easier to go to other parts like Asia and other parts of the world, Africa, etc. Because once they've got that 510K, also some parts of Saudi Arabia. But you also see companies who get the 510K, try to sell their product, and then realize it's not economically viable and there's no reimbursement pathway. Now, luckily, with education out there, companies are taking the regulatory and reimbursement pathway a lot more seriously, but this still happens to this day. You'll still see companies get the regulatory approval and then realize that the reimbursement's just not working for them. And then unfortunately, these companies folded. They may have a fantastic product that's going to go out and change lives, but if they haven't got money in, then they can't keep making these products, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. I know you kind of are a big proponent of beginning with the end in mind. I quote Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Begin with the end in mind. How are you planning to get paid? And you have to really build that in. And the other thing I think about is you mentioned baby companies, and you might have mentioned this at the very beginning, but when I think about reimbursement strategy, if you explore that early enough in the product development cycle and you kind of extrapolate out to the nth degree to when you're actually in the hospital and you're selling and you recognize this isn't viable, you could actually go back, change your indications for use, change some of the things in the design itself and be more profitable. And maybe a slight change. Would you agree with that or elaborate? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, very much so. So I remember when I first got an exposure, I was speaking to a reimbursement consultant and they said the same. I was always like, no, regulatory first, like, no, reimbursement first. And the example that they gave me, Etienne, exactly how you just explained it is depending on the indication, the claims you make for your product, you may be suitable for a different reimbursement code. And it could be the difference between getting $100 for it and $700 for it, just by making a few simple changes. And as you highlighted, Etienne, if you build that in from the start, saying, okay, these are the two potential codes that we can go through. But if we change some claims and indications, we can go for this one, which seems more profitable and more in line with what we want to do. If you do that from the start, it's like a domino effect. You'll save thousands, 100,000, maybe even millions of dollars in the long run.
Yeah. Okay, I want to throw something else at you then. So in the US, we have everyone has their acronyms. It's just the industry, it's not the US, but RX versus OTC, prescription versus over the counter. There's different ways to get to market. Do you have any thoughts or advice, personal feelings about going straight to the market as far as going straight to the consumer versus going prescription first? And I might think of something like a blood pressure cuff or a CPAP machine and so on. Does it make sense in your mind one way or another, or have you thought about that sort of thing as far as when it comes to going straight to the consumer, selling on Amazon versus trying to sell to a hospital?
Again, I'm not the reimbursement expert here, but to me, it
Sure.
makes sense to go down the prescription route because then you're selling through a general practitioner or a physician, somebody who understands this product inside out and is going to allocate it to the right people. Where over the counter is just your average Joe, maybe that's just a bandage or something like that. But whereas your prescription is something that's in the system. And if a physician sees that this is a particular type of thing that they need, they can prescribe that to you as well. Also, by going in the prescription pathway, it's kind of you can pay yourself to real world competitors. You can build that data from there. There'll be clinical data existing on there. So I really think, Etienne, it depends on what your device actually is. It may make sense to make it over the counter, if something just like a wound dressing or a bandage, 100% that makes sense. But if something is very, very complex and requires the needs of a physician, you're probably going to be going down the prescription pathway.
Right. Yeah. Real world evidence, you've mentioned this multiple times in health economics. That's increasingly important. What are your thoughts on how people should integrate these elements into the product development regulatory strategies?
So the easiest way would be post-market surveillance. So as part of your post-market surveillance, you should be getting real-world data. What are your competitors doing? What are things happening in the industry? And again, this is me being slightly controversial here. I don't consider the EU MDR to be a new regulation. I think we've mentioned this before on the past live. I call it the MDD plus, and there's a lot of people that say that to me too. It's basically was the old MDD with more responsibility and things that companies should be doing anyway. I mean, to me, post-market surveillance is a complete no-brainer. You should be out there on the market trying to find out, okay, what are the methods of which my product might fail? How are the other products out there performing on the market? Bring that evidence in and then come in and improve your product. I mean, that's just basic business effectively, not even medical devices. What are the potential ways that my product or service can go wrong? And then what can I start doing to bring that in? And then you might have preventive action. So I think the best way of doing that is well. Also, there's a lot of platforms out there as well that share sort of clinical evidence, etc. But also have someone clinical on your team looking for clinical stuff. I mean, you wouldn't hire a guy in sales to go out and look at literature because that's not really their forte. And again, so if you have a clinical team or you have a clinical expert, have them go out and get information on these sort of things. And that's really the best way of doing it is implement it in your post-market surveillance. So it's built into your quality management system. It's something you're going to be talking about on your management reviews. Don't just rely on, we're going to find out passively. My view is make it part of your post-market surveillance. And also when it comes to the EU MDR under Article 10.9, there's also this requirement for, it's called a strategy for regulatory compliance. Build that into there that you will be looking for real world data. You will be looking for these different ways in terms of information you can find. And also state the methods that you're going to use, whether it's signing up to journals, whether it's using experts. And then you can build that in your strategy for regulatory compliance report. That is the best way around it.
That makes sense. It's Yeah, it's funny when you mention that, when you talk about all those different things, post-market surveillance, I just keep going back to the phrase begin with the end in mind. You have to have the whole picture really in your mind or on paper somehow with an understanding that yes, we're trying to solve this problem. These are the indications that we want to solve. This is how we want to get paid. This is how we're going to make sure that what we've accomplished, all these different things. Do you have any suggestions for companies just to keep all of that straight and really to understand that they have met all of the requirements all along the way, not just from a regulatory standpoint, but from a business standpoint and understanding all of the requirements that are going to be needed to be profitable?
Yeah, effectively, we could take like the agile approach here. So when it comes to agile, we have a couple week check-in. So you don't have check-in points. It's very easy to get bundled down with your work. And this is the mistake that companies make. Our QMS audit is going to be due in a couple of weeks' time. Drop everything and let's do QMS straight for 2 weeks. If you're doing QMS right from the start, you should be audit ready all the time. And that's what any good auditor or anybody would tell you. Hence why in the EU, we have the concept of what's known as the unannounced audit. You should be audit ready at any given time. Yes, of course, it makes sense to prepare, to have resources, make sure there's people available on your team, but you should be ready for this all the time. So my view here is always have stop points. And I think one great way of doing it, of course, I go back to the management review. And Etienne, you may have seen this too. If you look at your typical company, how often are they doing a management review? Once annually, which in my view is not enough. Do them more often. Why not have a monthly annual review? And then what you can do in your procedure and the way around it is you could say something like, we're going to have at minimum once every year a management review, but why not have 12? Why not have 15? It leaves you open. It means you're still following your procedure. And the beauty of a management review, you've got all of the heads there. You've got the head of quality, you've got the head of R&D, you've got the design and development team all in one room and they can speak to each other. In any business, it's very difficult to get a lot of people together in one room. And that is the beauty of the management review. And there's nothing in the regulations to say that in your management review meeting, you can't talk about other things. You can't talk about general business. Why not? If you've got all these people in the room and you want to spend another 20 minutes just talking about general business metrics, reimbursement, I say, why not? All the people are there in the room. You've got the greatest minds in your company. Get together and discuss these things. Don't just think that, oh, we're just going to do the minimum for regulatory. You can also do extra things. And if anything, you're going to impress the auditor because it shows that you're being proactive.
Actually, I want to I want to touch on that just a little bit deeper. Previously, prior to QMSR, the quality management system regulation that FDA has pivoted to, used to it was QSR, then this is coming from 21 CFR Part 820, and apologize for throwing all of the word salad or alphabet soup at you. But with the FDA changing this, previously they would not look at management review, internal audits, et cetera. Now that is being harmonized with ISO 1345:2016, which was available for auditors to review. Now, you mentioned the management review. Of course, you're going to talk about all things quality, all things regulatory, and really cover the gamut. And you want to be thorough. And I agree, more than once a year makes sense. Your leadership team is probably getting together more than once a year, at least a quarter, most likely monthly, if not weekly. I mean, it's just the way business operates. But they don't always talk about those quality and regulatory things. Now, if you were to roll that into that maybe monthly, quarterly business review, and you do talk about those other things, do you recommend actually including all of that business discussion in that management review? Or I can just hear companies telling me, well, I don't want an auditor knowing about our inner workings or the struggles that we're facing in these other areas. What are your thoughts there?
My view here is you don't have to show that information to them as long as you tick the X boxes in terms of what's written in the regulation and the standard. And the way that you could do that is you just show them the part of the meeting minutes, which go towards whatever your policy or regulatory that you're having. And the other bits you can have redacted. You can do that. And I've seen it with companies sometimes, for example, if they're showing training records of an employee, they may say, hold on a few minutes, we're going to remove private information like their name, address, and telephone number, which is not required. So that'll be the best way around it. So that's a great point that you bring up, Etienne, as well. A lot of people under CFR 820 just will say, yes, we've had a management review meeting, but they don't have to show the minutes. But then in my view is probably the minutes weren't up to scratch in a lot of companies. And of course, under ISO 13485, you now have to show the minutes so people take it seriously. And the classic I can give is class one software as a medical device. So particularly some of my background as well, companies that are going from MDD to MDR, they were required to have technical files and a partial QMS and things like that. Were they up to scratch in my opinion? No, not really. And it's not the company's fault. It's because nobody's ever assessed it. If you don't assess something, how do you know you're up to scratch? And it's
Sure.
kind of like you go for your driving license. There's somebody there, you have to pass a driving test. There's a standard. But if you just say to anyone, hey, just jump in a car and you can go driving. How do you know you're up to scratch or following the rules? You wouldn't really know until someone assesses you. And I think that's the best way around it. So my view here is you can redact information if it's got nothing to do with the requirements of the regulatory and policy, and there's nothing wrong with that. So you might have a different section of your management review where you minute these things, and then you can leave that out during audit time.
The phrase, I don't know who I'm quoting here. I don't know who this comes from, but what gets measured gets managed. And I think that's accurate. If you're not paying attention to anything, of course it's going to start to slip and you stop really caring about it too much. So I am on the fence as to whether I like that the FDA is now going to be reviewing management review. I guess I'm a product of my country in that we have a very much an independence and anonymity, mindset. So there's whether that's good or bad, we can make that argument. I always love talking to you though, Karandeep, because I feel like we have the quintessential UK versus American when we have these conversations, and I love that because you kind of raise my awareness to a global view, and I really appreciate that about you. And actually, there's something about that I wanted to mention. Your take on the EUMDR is different than a lot of people that I mentioned. And it's interesting because you are in that situation. You're in the UK. I know, okay, the UK has its own thing going on, but you are surrounded by EUMDR. And your take is that it's MDD plus. And so I really appreciate that because it's a different perspective than a lot of the ones that I am familiar with. When it comes to reimbursement, do you see it as a similar situation? And can we go maybe, I don't want to go too deep because I think sometimes we lose people, but the pros and cons of the different types of reimbursement as it relates to the US. I don't know if you have any particular examples about how the EU performs its reimbursement through the government spending or the US through its healthcare insurance reimbursement. But do you have any just maybe pros and cons just very quickly?
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, so of course, it's the key fundamental differences when it comes to the UK and EU. Eventually we have free healthcare. It's based on the government, whereas with the US, it's usually work on an insurance-based system, which is quite common for your employer to contribute towards that, or you can have private insurance. So I think those are the key differences here, basically. So the benefits, of course, of the US compared to the EU, you have a large unified market. It's the whole of the US. Whereas the EU, we have different individual countries, as I was alluding to earlier, which can make it very confusing. So the benefit of the US is it's just a large unified system, and it's quite clear in terms of where you are. And you don't have to apply from state to state, which would be a complete different outcome nightmare if you had to do that as well. Also, again, Etienne, because you're in this space as well, generally speaking, the pricing is a lot less regulated, which means there are a lot of higher margins when it comes to the US. And hence why you see that just for some reason tends to be a lot more investment in the US. And it's not just a regulatory standpoint. A lot of companies tend to go to the US as it just seems there's a lot more money floating out there and it's a lot more profitable comparing on to the type of device that you're doing as well. So effectively, you can have a lot more premium pricing in compared to the EU. And because it's an insurance-based system, they may be willing to pay these kind of prices. Whereas if you have a government-based system, they're trying to save as much money as possible because that's generally how the government would work as well. And I generally find that there's a lot more flexibility as well. And also with the US, you have possibilities of temporary reimbursement pathway. So it may be a way to just get you on the market a little bit quicker whilst you're working out what you're going to do. But of course, the cons now of a US-based system is Medicare, Medicaid, and versus private insurers. Each of them have a different reimbursement requirements. I can't really dig into details of that, but then that can cause a little bit of confusion as well. And devices covered by Medicare may not be covered by private insurers and vice versa. That's something that you have to consider as well. The general process in the US can be quite slow and expensive initially. So, getting an FDA approval does not, and I repeat, does not mean automatic reimbursement. A 510K or de novo is not an automatic reimbursement. The breakthrough designation is to do with the regulatory, and again, is nothing to do with reimbursement. So that's very important the listeners realize that. And, getting things like new CPT codes can take years. And I was mentioning earlier, requires clinical and economic data. And, it's kind of like then there's a higher out of pocket cost for patients as well when it comes to the US because it is an insurance based system. And from what I've seen about US based systems as well, if you have insurance, sometimes in some cases, you may have to make some contribution towards that. And depending on the cost, it could be quite expensive. So the patient may be sort of reluctant to do that due to financial reasons. Then now, if we compare it to the EU, of course, let's start with the pros of the EU. Generally speaking, there's faster market access when it comes to reimbursement. So, if you're a company out there and you're bootstrapped and it's a bit like, hey, look, the US may be more profitable, but we can get onto the EU maybe years quicker or months quicker. You may think, let's go to the EU, raise a bit of money, and then we go to the US, which is also a strategy which companies do in regulatory as well. They may go to one market, raise a bit of money, and then go to the other one. And then also, as I talked about the HTA regulation as well in EU, there's aims to harmonize it. So it's going to be a bit more like the US. So then companies out there may think, you know what, if the EU is going to be harmonized like the US, we then may go to the EU. And then also, again, government backed, because something is government backed, it means a lot more stability in compared to insurance. If you've got a government backed system when it comes to things like stocks and things like that, bonds as well, if something is government backed, it generally means it's a lot more stable in comparison to other markets. So the stability is an important one as well. And the EU tends to be a lot more standardized as well. And the big benefit here is when it comes to the patient, there's no direct cut to the patient. If I was to go and have a surgical procedure on the NHS, I wouldn't have to put my hand in my pocket or worry about how much this medical device cost or anything like that. The government's taking all care of that for me. All I do is turn up to my surgery, I get the service, and I'm on my way. Whereas where in the US, where you have basically that there is some form of patient contribution, depending on the procedure that you're getting, can generally drive how much out of pocket you're going to be as well. Now, of course, there's cons. And the biggest cons, of course, is the fragmented market, country by country reimbursement requirements. So the EU is made up of so many different countries, and it can be a complete nightmare. So getting reimbursed in France doesn't mean that you can get reimbursed in Germany or in other parts of the EU. So that's something that you have to look into as well, applying to each country as well. And then, of course, with the EU, it's a big factor here. Languages. Everyone in the US is speaking English and everything is in English. Whereas you go to Europe, you have French, German, Spanish, Italian, you have all these different languages. And Etienne, as you know as well, when you translate something from one language to another, things can get lost in translation. And, if there's anybody out there who's a language expert and can speak multiple languages, go out and read the EU MDR in each and every different language.
Oh,
And I would swear to you, some of the
yes.
requirements can come across as completely different. And that causes a complete minefield. So, you need different language experts, which again can get quite costly, and somebody who understands how the government of that country works as well. And also strict cost controls as well, because it's a government-based system. It's generally going to be strict in terms of how much you can charge. And that's really it as well. So I think those are the key systems. Yeah, it just seems that with the US, you can maybe command higher prices. And with the EU, it's basically possibly can be arguably safer because it's government backed, but then you're kind of capped in terms of how much there is. So again, just like with the regulatory spaces, there's pros and cons of the EU or the US, but there's so many factors involved to say which is better than the other. That's the key question that your company has to ask is, I don't think there's one better or the other. It's kind of what is the best for you as a company and what you're trying to do.
That's really good. I love the amount of detail that you put into that. It's interesting that we're doing this we mentioned at the very beginning, the relevance of the different topics that we're taking just at the amount of time that it's taken to get this episode out. When I think about the US and the changes that are happening at the US, some of those things that you mentioned regarding the reimbursement due to the CPT codes. Just when I've looked into the CPT codes and the way it's determined, that the American Medical Association is the one who appoints that editorial panel. They meet 3 times a year and they determine how much is this CPT code going to cost and how much is this. And that's kind of an interesting thing. It's just this one group. And I'll just mention this just because I just want to kind of highlight the potential changes that are even coming even yet. When we look at across the government, you mentioned today some of the changes that are happening there in your country. The new FDA commissioner being appointed, Marty McCary, I believe his name is. If anyone has read his book, The Price We Pay for Healthcare, he is a big proponent of the way of changing a lot of those things. So I'm a big believer in planning for the future, planning for today and what you have, what you expect things to be as it is today, but also understanding where we could potentially be going. No one really knows exactly where that is here in the US. Hopefully things are a little bit more stable in other places, but yeah, I'll stop rambling or whatever this is, but I just want to give that just caveat that a lot of things, it is a changing market that we're seeing. But the one thing that I would take away, and maybe I'll ask you this question, if our listeners could take away one thing, what would that be? I'm going to tell you what my takeaway is, and that is there are layers to developing a medical device and the strategy of the medical device. The regulatory layer is one that we preach a lot. Understand your regulatory pathway, understand your regulatory regions that you want to go to as far as your patient populations and clinical investigations, et cetera. If it's to the US, is it 510K? Is it a de novo? Do you need to go the PMA pathway? What class are you? What risk? But this other layer of reimbursement is stratospheric. It's very foundational to the development of your medical device, even to the very beginning in the product development space. But I'd be curious what your thought is. What are if there's one major takeaway you'd like the listeners to come away with, what would that be?
Yeah, so I suppose, reimbursement isn't just the final step of a regulatory approval. Consider it a core business strategy, and it should be part of your business strategy from day one. You can have the most innovative, the most world-changing medical device in the world, but if you don't have a clear reimbursement or regulatory strategy, no hospital or no payer is going to buy it. So the earlier that you align this, the better off that you are. Whether that's the EU or whether that's the US, the principles behind the regulatory strategy are more or less the same. Of course, the way that you go about it and the way that you get reimbursed is going to be different. But this is basically what it is. And then, as we were alluding to earlier as well, the world is very unpredictable at the moment. What's happening in the UK, what's happening with the FDA. So, by all means, have that one jurisdiction that makes the most sense for you. But, don't discount on the parts of the world. At least have them there in the back of your mind. So if something does change, for better or for worse, at least then you can change your strategy. I think that's the key to a core business strategy. If something doesn't work out, you can maybe take a different path. Don't be too strict on just one. Have some sort of buyout clause or a different way that you can just take if everything doesn't go to plan.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned the agile approach. Just keep revising, keep moving, being agile, being flexible. So that makes sense. Karandeep, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate all of the knowledge that you're willing to share. We'll put links in the show notes to just show people how they can get a hold of you, kind of talk more if they have more questions and reach out. If you haven't followed Karandeep on LinkedIn, I highly recommend that you follow him and check out the things that he shares. He has a global approach and a very systematic way of doing things, and I always appreciate about Karandeep. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening, and we will let you all get back to the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you very much, Etienne.
Thanks for tuning in to the Global Medical Device Podcast. If you found value in today's conversation, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. If you've got thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@greenlight.guru. Stay connected for more insights into the future of MedTech innovation. And if you're ready to take your product development to the next level, visit us at www.greenlight.guru. Until next time, keep innovating and improving the quality of life.